Hey everyone, it's Dr. Hall. We're going to continue our discussion this week of learning and memory in lecture 20, which is part 2, and we're going to first talk about retrieval of memories. So when you consciously recall a declarative memory, so remember declarative memories can be semantic facts or episodic stories and events things that happened, you are picking it out of your long-term memory and moving it back into your short-term memory where you have conscious awareness of it and you can manipulate it and talk about it and read it. So I like to think of this a lot as long-term memory is like when you have files stored on your computer and they're not usually open. And then when you retrieve a memory, you open the file and then you can see it, you can read it, you can interact with it. And interestingly, you can also edit it. So that's going to come up a little bit later. So let's just remember here is our little infographic of that process of forming memories, right? And we have that moving short-term memory into long-term memory is called encoding. And then taking that information out of our long-term memory by opening up that file and bringing it into our conscious awareness, our short-term memory is retrieval. So think of it like opening files that are stored on your computer. There are 3 different ways that we tend to retrieve memories. There's recall with 2 types, free and cued, recognition and relearning. So when we're trying to remember something, so this is like when we're consciously trying to remember something, what are the different ways that we might be doing it? So I'm going to go through these one by one. So recall is the ability to come up with it, right? So it's like, oh, what was her name again? Or what did you do last Saturday? And there's no hints or anything. It's a free text entry question. It's a fill in the blank. And you have to come up with the piece of information, right? So if I said, what is released from the axon terminal of a preganglionic neuron in the autonomic nervous system? Perhaps you can come up with the correct answer, but perhaps you can't. Perhaps your memory is not robust enough or your retrieval process is not robust enough to be able to come up with that with no hints. So then I could give you some hints and we would call that cued recall. So in one of the videos that you'll watch for this lecture, they talk about chunking and organizing things in categories that make sense. And they talk about memorizing a list of foods. And if you put it into categories of these are the produce items, these are the dairy items, then it's easier to do. Whereas if it's just a random list with no kind of organization or structure or conceptual relationships between the things, it's much harder. So I can give you hints, right? I could say it's a neurotransmitter, and you might be like, that doesn't really help. I kind of figured that much already. Or I could say it's also the neurotransmitter that's released by the axon terminal in the neuromuscular junction. Hopefully now, especially after the last lecture, you've got it, right? So it's going to be, or maybe you don't. I'm not going to tell you the answer. Let's see. All right, we'll talk about the other types of retrieving information. So recall is kind of the best. It's the most robust. You have the best handle on things. All right. I wanted to say those hints maybe are helping by activating our place cells or our concept cells, right? Giving you related concepts, right? Hoping to kind of get to that engram, that memory trace by lighting up some associated cells or place cells, right? So if you think about different parts of a grocery store, for example. All right, so here is that kind of same example. If I just gave you a list, bananas, milk, sugar, grapes, rice, bread, flour, cucumber, yogurt, and I gave you a certain number of seconds to try to memorize that, you would be able to recall some of them. Data suggests probably about 30% of them, depending on how much time I gave you, how much time and attention and effort you spent trying to remember them, how much rehearsal you did in your head. But if I gave them to you in groups like this, even if I didn't have the squares, where I put bananas, grapes, and cucumber all together, I put milk and yogurt together, I put rice and bread together, I put sugar and flour together, you would probably be able to remember about 75% of them. Similarly, if I, asked you to tell me back the words from the list and I gave you those categories, if I gave you produce, dairy, grains, and baking goods, right? Then you would be able to, so that's cued recall where we're giving you hints, right? So this talks about when you're in the process of learning, an encoding strategy is to do this chunking, grouping things together in ways that make conceptual sense. And we know that that strengthens your ability to form the memory, and it facilitates your ability to recall it or to retrieve that memory, possibly, as I mentioned, by recruiting these place cells and concept cells. So a lot of repetition in the last two slides, but the more we fire those neurons, the more you do long-term potentiation. We're amping up the AMPA receptors, making them more conductive to the ions, and we're also increasing the number of AMPA receptors on the cell membrane. Yes. Okay, so the second type of memory retrieval, which is kind of a little bit lower down now, is recognition. So you know it when you see it. So it's like a multiple choice question or a fill in the blank question with a word bank, which is basically a multiple choice question. So this is a little less robust. We're giving you more help this time. So you can see the question here: what is released from the axon terminal of a preganglionic neuron in the autonomic nervous system? The same question, but I've given you some options. Now I've given you some tricky options because these are all neurotransmitters that you have heard about recently, and so that maybe was not as helpful as if I maybe gave some of the wrong answer choices as serotonin or dopamine. So a lot of these are probably lighting up with recent memories. The answer is acetylcholine, by the way. All right, the third and final type of retrieval is something that you may not think of as actually retrieving a memory, and this is called relearning. So it was interesting, earlier today I was walking by the physics tutor lab, and they have some like trigonometry formulas up on the wall, and so that's what the image is showing you here, is some, you know, how you calculate sine and cosine in tangent. And as I was walking past, I didn't stop and look at them, and I was like, gosh, I have no recollection what those are. Like, I vaguely remember that they have to do with things for angles and the sides of a triangle, but if you asked me to define them, there's no way I could, even though there was a time in my life where I was really, really good at this, where I knew this frontwards, backwards, and inside out. I took a good deal of math. I loved math, but yet I haven't used it. Remember, use it or lose it. And so if you asked me to explain how to calculate sine or what's the difference between sine or cosine or tangent, I could not have told you. However, if you then went to teach me, I would learn it pretty quickly. So this is relearning. This is when you can't consciously recall or recognize a specific memory. Like I'm like, okay, that's what a cosine is. I didn't consciously remember that. I didn't even recognize it as like, oh yeah, that's the right answer. But if you were to teach this to me again, I would learn it way, way, way faster and become much more facile with it much more quickly than the first time around. So what that means is my brain kept some of it, right? So I wasn't starting from total zero. I wasn't starting from total scratch. So even though I consciously couldn't articulate it, even though I didn't feel like I had any memory of it, some of it was still in there deep, right? So I still had access to some of that information because then I was able to catch on much more quickly. And so a lot of what we do, hopefully in this class, I try to come back to previous concepts we've learned before so that you are practicing with your recall if you can, or at least recognition, or we're at the very least doing relearning to kind of up and improve those memories through that long-term potentiation. So when we look at types of retrieval, right, the least robust, the one is like, gosh, I don't have it, right? That will at least help you with relearning. But then as you kind of increase in terms of your facility with the information, the strength of the coding of the memory, the strength of your ability to retrieve it, then you're going to be able to do free recall, right? That's the most robust one. So that's why we give you different types of questions. Okay. So the other important thing, Oliver's, hello. The other important thing to realize is that every time you retrieve information and you bring it into your short-term memory, you then have to encode it again and reconsolidate it into your long-term memory. And so again, it's that, use that analogy of opening up a file on your computer. When you open up the file on your computer to read it, you can also edit it, sometimes on purpose and sometimes not. So what's interesting with memories is when we recall them and then we restore them again, they often change, sometimes a lot, sometimes a little, sometimes because someone is amping up certain parts of that memory, like, oh my gosh, remember that birthday party? That was so much fun. I had the best time ever, which will cause you then to most likely remember it in a slightly more positive light than you may have before, or vice versa. So what's interesting about this is that our memories are subject to change over time, especially the more we recall them and think about them, because we're manipulating them and moving things around. And it's also why we are vulnerable to forming false memories. There have been a lot of studies done on this. It's well known in psychology, and it's one of the reasons why eyewitness testimony is actually not as reliable as you would like it to be. So the study that's referenced in the graphic that you can see here is researchers intentionally tried to convince young adults that they had actually committed a crime when they were teenagers. And they did this over a series of 3 different interviews where they were using specific suggestive techniques, right? They were doing this on purpose. But 70% of them actually ended up developing a false memory. And a robust false memory full of lots of details about the event, details about the emotions felt, all kinds of things. So just keep in mind, our minds are living things and things can change in response to external influences. So beware, right? That can be for good and for bad. All right, so in summary, for memory retrieval, we are taking information that we had stored on our computer, right? We've saved these files on our computer. We're opening them up. We're bringing them back into short-term memory so that we can see them and interact with them. The most robust way we do this is recall. We're like, oh yeah, I've got it. I know it. You don't even need to give me a hint. I know exactly what this is. Cued recall would be, if you just give me a little hint, I will get there. And then kind of next down from that is recognition. Like, I can't come up with it on my own, but if you say, oh yeah, his name's Jim, you're like, yeah, it's Jim. Or relearning, right? So maybe I totally forgot that person's name, but the next time around I learn it more quickly and easily and it sticks a little bit better. So just remember that chunking and relating things to other concepts or ideas are very helpful in terms of strengthening our memories and abilities to retrieve that. You'll read and watch some of that in the media assignments for this lecture. And then also remember that after we retrieve it, we re-encode and reconsolidate. And so it's always vulnerable to change. Memories rarely stay completely intact from what they once were. So we have that risk of false memories to just make life a little bit more complicated. All right, that's it for 28. Thanks.